On the evening of November 14th, 1958, Dr. Harold Finch sat alone in his dental office on East 63rd Street in Manhattan, reviewing the day's patient files under the warm glow of his desk lamp. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter drifted past the window, settling on the sidewalks of a city still buzzing with the anxieties of the Cold War. The newspapers that morning had carried stories of Soviet Premier Khrushchev's ultimatum over Berlin, and the fear of nuclear annihilation seemed to hang over every American household like an invisible fog. Yet for Dr. Finch, a 52-year-old dentist with over 25 years of experience treating patients from every walk of life, the evening promised nothing more remarkable than a quiet review of his records before heading home to his wife Margaret in their modest brownstone on the Upper West Side. He could not have imagined that within the hour he would set in motion a chain of events that would expose one of the most deeply embedded Soviet agents ever to operate on American soil. He believed, as most Americans did, that spies were the stuff of Hollywood films and sensational newspaper headlines, not the quiet professional men who came to his office complaining of toothaches and requesting routine cleanings. He was about to learn how terribly wrong that assumption could be. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Dr. Harold Finch had built his practice from nothing. The son of a watchmaker from Queens, he had inherited from his father both a steady hand and an obsession with precision. Growing up in a small apartment above the shop, where his father repaired timepieces from across the city, young Harold had learned that the difference between excellence and mediocrity often lay in details invisible to the untrained eye. A watch that appeared to run perfectly might be losing 3 seconds every day due to a nearly imperceptible flaw in its escapement mechanism. A dental restoration that looked acceptable might fail within months because of microscopic gaps that allowed decay to creep beneath the surface. His father had died when Harold was 17, leaving behind modest debts and a collection of tools that Harold sold to pay for his first year of college. He had worked his way through Columbia University's dental school during the Depression, taking odd jobs at factories and warehouses, delivering newspapers before dawn, and studying by candlelight when the electricity was shut off for non-payment. By 1958, he had established himself as one of the most respected dentists in Manhattan, known particularly for his meticulous attention to detail and his photographic memory for the dental work he had performed over the decades. His patients included bankers, lawyers, professors, and even a few minor celebrities from the Broadway theater scene. Each mouth he examined was like a unique landscape to him, with its own geography of fillings, crowns, and bridges that he committed to memory with almost unconscious precision. What made Dr. Finch truly exceptional was his understanding that dental work was a form of autobiography written in enamel and amalgam. Every filling told a story about when and where it had been placed, what materials had been available, what techniques had been in fashion. A patient who had grown up in poverty might have teeth marked by childhood neglect, by cavities that had been filled with the cheapest materials by overwhelmed public health dentists. A patient who had lived through the war in Europe might carry the scars of emergency extractions performed in field hospitals, of repairs made with whatever materials could be scrounged from the ruins of bombed-out clinics. Dr. Finch had made it his business to understand these stories, to recognize the distinctive signatures of dental work from different eras and different places. He subscribed to journals from around the world, corresponded with colleagues in Europe and South America, and had even taken a trip to London in 1952 to attend a conference on international dental standards. His knowledge of foreign dental techniques was considered authoritative among his peers, and he had occasionally been consulted by insurance companies and legal firms that needed expert opinions on the origins of particular dental work. It was this gift that would prove to be the undoing of a man who called himself Richard Mallory. Mallory had first appeared in Dr. Finch's office 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1955. He presented himself as a commercial photographer who had recently relocated from Chicago to pursue opportunities in the New York advertising industry. He was a man of medium height with graying hair, unremarkable features, and the kind of pleasant, forgettable face that seemed designed not to attract attention. His accent carried the flat vowels of the Midwest, and he spoke knowledgeably about the Cubs and the politics of Illinois. He mentioned that he had grown up on the South Side, attended public schools, and developed his interest in photography during a stint in the Army Signal Corps during the final years of the war. Everything about him suggested an ordinary American life, the kind of biography that would blend seamlessly into the fabric of post-war New York. He paid in cash, always arrived precisely on time for his appointments, and exchanged the sort of small talk that revealed nothing of consequence. He complained about the weather, expressed mild opinions about the Yankees and the Giants, and occasionally mentioned a girlfriend who worked as a receptionist at a law firm downtown. In every respect, he was the ideal patient, the kind of man who made Dr. Finch's work easy and unremarkable. During that first examination, Dr. Finch had noted that Mallory's teeth showed evidence of considerable previous dental work. There were several amalgam fillings in his molars, a gold crown on his lower left first molar, and what appeared to be an old root canal on his upper right canine. The work was competent but unremarkable, exactly what one would expect from a middle-aged American who had received standard dental care throughout his life. Dr. Finch made his notes, performed a routine cleaning, and scheduled a follow-up appointment for 6 months later. Mallory became just another name in the filing cabinet, another face in the parade of patients who passed through the office each week. Over the following 3 years, Mallory returned every 6 months like clockwork. He never missed an appointment, never complained about the cost of treatment, and never asked for anything beyond routine maintenance of his teeth. He mentioned once that his photography business was doing well, that he had landed a contract with a major advertising firm, and that he was thinking of buying an apartment in Brooklyn Heights. These details emerged gradually, casually, building the picture of a successful middle-class American professional living the post-war dream. Dr. Finch had no reason to question any of it. Then came November 14th, 1958. That evening, as Dr. Finch reviewed his patient files, he came across the folder for a new patient he had examined that afternoon, a woman named Catherine Brennan, who worked as a secretary at the United Nations. Her examination had been routine, but as Dr. Finch studied the notes he had made about her dental history, something began to nag at the back of his mind. Catherine had mentioned during the appointment that she was engaged to be married to a wonderful man who also worked at the United Nations, a translator in the Soviet Affairs section named Richard Mallory. Dr. Finch set down his pen and stared at the wall. Richard Mallory, the same Richard Mallory who had been his patient for 3 years. The man who claimed to be a commercial photographer from Chicago. Perhaps it was a different Richard Mallory. It was not such an uncommon name. But Catherine had described her fiancé as a man of medium height with graying hair and a pleasant face, a quiet and modest man who spoke several languages and seemed to know something about everything. The description matched the Richard Mallory, who sat in his dental chair every 6 months with almost perfect precision. Dr. Finch reached for the telephone to call his wife and tell her he would be late, but then he hesitated. Something else was bothering him, something that had nothing to do with the coincidence of names and descriptions. It was something about Mallory's teeth. He pulled Mallory's file from the cabinet and spread it across his desk. For several minutes he studied the detailed charts he had made over 3 years of examinations. He examined his notes about the fillings, the crown, the root canal. And as he studied, the vague unease in his mind began to crystallize into something sharper and more disturbing. The dental work in Richard Mallory's mouth was not American. Dr. Finch had spent more than 2 decades studying teeth, and over those years he had developed an almost instinctive ability to recognize the characteristics of dental work performed in different countries and different eras. American dentistry in the 1940s and 50s had developed along very specific lines, using particular materials, techniques, and approaches that left distinctive signatures in a patient's mouth. The amalgam fillings used by American dentists had a specific composition of silver, tin, copper, and mercury that differed subtly from the formulations used in other countries. The techniques for placing crowns, performing root canals, and shaping restorations followed protocols taught in American dental schools and refined through American professional associations. Richard Mallory's dental work did not follow these patterns. The fillings in his molars were made from a zinc phosphate cement that American dentists rarely used for permanent restorations. The gold crown on his lower left first molar had been fabricated using a technique that Dr. Finch had never seen in American dental work, a method where the crown appeared to have been hammered and adapted to the tooth rather than cast from a precise wax mold. Most tellingly, the root canal on his upper right canine showed evidence of having been performed without anesthesia, the telltale signs of rushed, painful work that Dr. Finch associated with the few patients he had treated who had received dental care in war-torn Europe or other parts of the world where American standards did not apply. Dr. Finch leaned back in his chair, his heart beginning to beat faster. He was not a political man, not someone who followed the news of spies and counter-espionage with any particular interest. But he knew enough to understand that if Richard Mallory was not who he claimed to be, if he was not a commercial photographer from Chicago, but rather some kind of foreign agent working at the United Nations, then this was a matter of the gravest national importance. He thought about calling the police, but something told him that this was beyond the jurisdiction of ordinary law enforcement. He thought about calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but the idea of phoning the FBI seemed absurd and melodramatic, like something out of a pulp magazine. What would he say? That he suspected a patient of being a Soviet spy because of the composition of his dental fillings. They would think he had lost his mind. But Dr. Finch had not survived the depression and built a successful practice by ignoring his instincts. The evidence before him might seem circumstantial to others, but to his trained eye, it told a story as clear as any confession. Richard Mallory's teeth had been worked on by dentists trained in techniques that were distinctly foreign, most likely Eastern European or Soviet. The materials used were not available through American dental suppliers, and the man who claimed to be a Midwestern photographer was actually working as a translator at the United Nations with access to some of the most sensitive diplomatic communications of the Cold War era. Dr. Finch picked up the telephone and dialed a number he had never expected to call. The man who answered identified himself simply as Agent Morrison. He listened without interruption as Dr. Finch explained his concerns, asking only occasional questions to clarify specific details about the dental techniques and materials involved. When Dr. Finch finished speaking, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Agent Morrison said very quietly that Dr. Finch should not speak to anyone else about this matter. He should go home, behave normally, and wait for further contact. Under no circumstances should he attempt to confront Mallory or alter his normal professional behavior in any way. The FBI would take it from here. Dr. Finch hung up the phone with trembling hands. He gathered his papers, locked his office, and walked home through the falling snow, wondering if he had just made the most important phone call of his life, or if he had simply embarrassed himself by reporting innocent coincidences to federal authorities. He would learn the truth soon enough. Agent Thomas Morrison had been with the FBI's Counterintelligence Division for 12 years, and in that time, he had learned never to dismiss seemingly trivial information. Some of the most important breaks in espionage cases came from the most unexpected sources, from vigilant landlords who noticed unusual behavior, from postal workers who reported suspicious packages, from ordinary citizens who simply felt that something was not quite right. A dentist reporting concerns about a patient's dental work was unusual, certainly, but Morrison had long ago learned that the unusual was precisely where he needed to pay the closest attention. The morning after Dr. Finch's phone call, Morrison pulled the file on Richard Mallory from the FBI's records. What he found was both reassuring and troubling. Mallory's background had been checked when he was hired as a translator at the United Nations 3 years earlier. His credentials were in order. His references from Chicago checked out. His employment history was documented. He had never been the subject of any security concerns or investigations. But Morrison also knew that the Soviet intelligence services were masters of what they called legends, the elaborate false identities created for agents who were sent to live and work in foreign countries. These legends were often impeccable on paper, supported by forged documents, fake references, and carefully constructed backstories that could withstand casual investigation. The only way to unmask such agents was to find the small cracks in their facades, the tiny inconsistencies that accumulated over time and eventually revealed the truth beneath the fiction. A dentist's observation about unusual dental work might be exactly such a crack. Morrison contacted the FBI's technical laboratory and requested an expert consultation on foreign dental techniques. Within 2 days, he had assembled a small team that included a forensic odontologist named Dr. Miriam Kaslow, who had worked with the military during World War II, identifying the remains of soldiers and civilians from dental records. Dr. Kaslow had extensive experience with dental work from across Europe and had developed a specialized expertise in distinguishing the techniques and materials used in different countries. When Morrison showed her Dr. Finch's notes on Richard Mallory's dental work, her reaction was immediate and unequivocal. The patterns described were consistent with Soviet dental practices of the 1940s and early 1950s. The zinc phosphate cement, the hammered crown technique, the evidence of procedures performed without anesthesia, these were all hallmarks of dental work performed in the Soviet Union, where materials were scarce, techniques were crude by American standards, and patient comfort was a secondary consideration to functional repair. Morrison felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the beginning of a major case. If Mallory was indeed a Soviet agent, he had been operating inside the United Nations for 3 years, with access to diplomatic communications, translation work, and the kind of routine proximity to sensitive information that intelligence services valued above almost anything else. The damage he might have caused could be incalculable. But Morrison also knew that he had to proceed with extreme caution. The evidence so far was suggestive but not conclusive. Foreign dental work alone was not proof of espionage. Mallory might be an innocent immigrant who had simply fabricated a more American-sounding background to improve his professional prospects. He might be a naturalized citizen who had received dental work in Europe before coming to the United States. There were many explanations that did not involve Soviet intelligence. Morrison needed more evidence. He needed to know who Richard Mallory really was. The investigation that followed was one of the most delicate and painstaking operations Morrison had ever conducted. His team could not risk alerting Mallory to their interest, could not interview his colleagues or neighbors without potentially compromising the entire case. Instead, they had to rely on surveillance, background research, and the slow accumulation of circumstantial evidence that might eventually build into something more substantial. Morrison assembled a small team of trusted agents, men and women who had experience in long-term surveillance operations and who understood the patience required to build an espionage case. They established observation posts in apartments and buildings near Mallory's residence and workplace, rotating personnel frequently to avoid detection. They photographed everyone who entered or left Mallory's building, meticulously documenting his daily patterns and any deviations from his routine. The technical experts at FBI headquarters provided state-of-the-art surveillance equipment, including long-range cameras and directional microphones that could pick up conversations from a distance. But Morrison used these tools sparingly, knowing that excessive surveillance could itself become suspicious if noticed by a trained agent. The key was to observe without being observed, to learn everything about Mallory's life while leaving no trace of their presence. They watched Mallory's apartment in Brooklyn Heights, noting his comings and goings, the visitors he received, the patterns of his daily life. They reviewed his employment records at the United Nations, looking for any anomalies in his work history or professional relationships. They investigated his supposed background in Chicago, searching for anyone who actually remembered the commercial photographer named Richard Mallory. What they found was a ghost. The photography studio in Chicago, where Mallory claimed to have worked, had closed in 1952, 3 years before he supposedly relocated to New York. The owner had died, and the business records had been destroyed in a fire that investigators now suspected might not have been accidental. The addresses Mallory had listed on his employment applications corresponded to buildings that had been demolished or converted to other uses. The references he had provided were people who seemed to exist on paper, but could not be located in the flesh. Morrison's team spent weeks tracking down leads in Chicago, interviewing former neighbors and colleagues of the people Mallory claimed to have known. Nobody remembered him. The elderly woman who had supposedly been his landlady for 3 years could not recall any tenant by that name. The camera shop where he claimed to have bought his equipment had no record of his purchases. The Army records that should have documented his service in the Signal Corps contained inconsistencies and gaps that suggested they had been fabricated or altered. The more they investigated, the more the picture became clear. Richard Mallory was a fiction, a character created from whole cloth and inserted into the fabric of American society with meticulous attention to detail. Someone had spent considerable time and resources constructing his legend, forging documents, creating false trails, and building a background story that could withstand casual investigation. This was not the work of an amateur or a lone actor. This was the product of a professional intelligence organization with extensive experience in placing agents under deep cover. Everywhere Morrison's team looked, they found evidence that Richard Mallory's past had been carefully constructed from fragments and phantoms, a legend built from pieces of real American life that could not be independently verified. Meanwhile, the surveillance team began to notice subtle oddities in Mallory's behavior. He frequently walked the same routes through the city, but varied his timing in ways that suggested he was checking for followers. He occasionally entered buildings through one entrance and exited through another. He made phone calls from public telephone booths rather than from his apartment, and he sometimes traveled to neighborhoods where he had no obvious personal or professional connections. These were the hallmarks of tradecraft, the operational security measures employed by trained intelligence agents to avoid detection. Mallory was behaving not like an innocent translator, but like a man who had been taught to assume he was always being watched. Still, Morrison hesitated to move against Mallory without more concrete evidence. The FBI had been burned before by cases that seemed airtight, but fell apart under legal scrutiny. The espionage laws required proof of actual intelligence activity, not merely suspicious behavior or a fabricated background. Morrison needed something more, some piece of evidence that would definitively connect Mallory to Soviet intelligence. That evidence would come from the most unlikely source imaginable. Dr. Harold Finch had tried to put the matter out of his mind after his phone call to the FBI. He had received no further contact from the authorities, and as the weeks passed, he began to wonder if his concerns had been dismissed as the paranoid imaginings of an overworked dentist. He returned to his normal routine, seeing patients, performing procedures, and trying not to think about the man named Richard Mallory who would be due for his next appointment in March. But fate had other plans. In early February of 1959, Dr. Finch received an emergency call from a distressed woman who identified herself as Catherine Brennan. Her fiancé had developed a severe toothache over the weekend, she explained, and his regular dentist was unavailable. She had heard that Dr. Finch was highly recommended and wondered if he might be able to see Richard on short notice. Dr. Finch's heart nearly stopped. Of course, Mallory's regular dentist was unavailable. Dr. Finch was Mallory's dentist. Catherine did not know that her fiancé had been secretly maintaining two separate dental relationships in New York, one under his real identity and one under whatever identity he used in his personal life with her. Dr. Finch agreed to see the patient, his mind racing with the implications of what this might mean. If Mallory was maintaining separate identities, using different dentists for different aspects of his life, then the FBI's suspicions were almost certainly correct. This was the behavior of a man living a double life, a man who could not risk having the various threads of his existence cross and entangle. That afternoon, Richard Mallory walked into Dr. Finch's office and sat in the dental chair, unaware that he was placing himself directly in the hands of the man who had set the FBI on his trail. He complained of pain in his lower right molar and asked for an examination. Dr. Finch nodded professionally and prepared his instruments, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his mind. As he examined Mallory's mouth, Dr. Finch noticed something he had not seen in previous appointments. There was a new filling in one of Mallory's upper teeth, a filling that had obviously been placed within the past few weeks. The work was crude, performed with materials and techniques that matched the distinctive patterns Dr. Finch had first observed 3 years earlier. Someone had been performing dental work on Richard Mallory, and that someone was clearly not an American dentist. Dr. Finch completed his examination and treated the painful molar with a temporary filling. He scheduled a follow-up appointment and watched Mallory leave the office, then immediately reached for the telephone to call Agent Morrison. The new filling was the break Morrison had been waiting for. If Mallory was receiving dental work from a non-American source, that source might be another agent, a contact within the Soviet intelligence network who was providing not only operational support, but also the kind of mundane personal care that agents needed to maintain their covers. Finding that source could crack open the entire network. Morrison intensified the surveillance on Mallory, adding additional agents and expanding the coverage to include his contacts at the United Nations and his movements throughout the city. Within 2 weeks, they had identified a pattern. Every few months, Mallory would travel to a small apartment building in the Bronx, entering through a rear entrance and remaining inside for approximately 1 hour before departing. The building was home to a doctor named Gregory Petrov, a Russian émigré who had arrived in the United States in 1948 and had established a modest medical practice serving the Russian community in the area. But Petrov was not just a doctor. He was also, as further investigation revealed, a dentist who had trained in Moscow before the war and who occasionally performed dental work for trusted patients in his small apartment office. Morrison now understood how Mallory had maintained his cover for so long. Petrov was his personal dentist, the man who kept Mallory's teeth in repair using the Soviet techniques and materials that he had learned in Moscow. Mallory could not risk visiting an American dentist for major work, because an American dentist might notice the same anomalies that Dr. Finch had detected. So he relied on Petrov for anything beyond the most routine maintenance, visiting the émigré dentist in secret and hoping that no one would ever connect the dots. The investigation expanded to include Petrov, and what Morrison's team discovered was far more extensive than they had imagined. Petrov was not merely a dentist who happened to serve Russian clients. He was a key node in a Soviet intelligence network that had been operating in New York since the late 1940s. His apartment was a meeting place for agents, a location where dead drops were serviced and communications were exchanged. The dental practice was a cover, a reason for people to come and go without attracting suspicion. Mallory, it turned out, was just one of several Soviet agents who had been receiving support from Petrov over the years. The network included translators, clerks, and low-level officials scattered throughout the diplomatic community in New York, all of them funneling information back to Moscow through a system of couriers and dead drops that Petrov helped to coordinate. The scale of the operation was staggering, far larger than anyone had imagined. Morrison faced a difficult decision. He could arrest Mallory and Petrov immediately, dismantling the network before it could cause further damage. But doing so would alert the other agents in the network, allowing them to flee or destroy evidence before they could be apprehended. The alternative was to continue the surveillance, mapping the full extent of the network and identifying all of its members before moving against any of them. This approach was riskier, because every day the network continued to operate was another day of potential damage to American security, but it offered the possibility of rolling up the entire operation in a single coordinated action. Morrison chose to wait. For the next 6 months, his team painstakingly documented every aspect of the network's operations. They identified 12 additional agents and sources, ranging from a secretary in the State Department to a researcher at a major defense contractor. They traced the communication channels and dead drop locations that the network used to pass information. They compiled evidence that would hold up in court and prepared for the day when they would finally move against their targets. Throughout this period, Dr. Finch continued to see Richard Mallory for his routine appointments, treating the man's teeth with professional competence while knowing that every visit was being monitored by federal agents. It was a strange and unsettling experience, performing the mundane tasks of his profession on a patient who he knew to be an enemy of his country. But Dr. Finch understood that his role in the investigation required him to maintain absolute normalcy, to give Mallory no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. The takedown came on September 8, 1959. The planning for the operation had taken months, with Morrison coordinating with FBI field offices across the country and liaising with the Justice Department to ensure that the legal foundations for the arrests were unassailable. Every agent and officer who would participate was briefed in person, given specific assignments and sworn to absolute secrecy. The operation would begin simultaneously at all locations at 6 o'clock in the morning, before the targets could begin their daily routines and potentially detect that something was amiss. Morrison himself led the team that would arrest Mallory. He had studied this man for months, reading surveillance reports and analyzing his patterns of behavior, and he wanted to be present when the legend finally collapsed. At 5:45 in the morning, Morrison and his team took up positions around the brownstone in Brooklyn Heights where Mallory lived. The street was quiet, the first pale light of dawn just beginning to brighten the eastern sky. Morrison checked his watch, took a deep breath, and nodded to his colleagues. At precisely 6 o'clock, agents simultaneously knocked on doors across New York City and beyond. In a coordinated operation involving more than 50 FBI agents and officers from multiple law enforcement agencies, the network was rolled up in a matter of hours. Mallory was arrested at his apartment in Brooklyn Heights, where agents found a shortwave radio hidden behind a false panel in the closet, codebooks concealed within the pages of hollowed-out books, and microfilm containing classified documents from the United Nations stored in a camera case. The evidence was overwhelming, a comprehensive collection of espionage equipment that left no doubt about Mallory's true occupation. When Morrison entered the apartment, Mallory was sitting calmly at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hand. He had known, from the moment he heard the knock at the door, that his long career as a deep-cover agent had come to an end. He offered no resistance, made no attempt to destroy evidence or flee. He simply looked at Morrison with the faintly amused expression of a chess player who has been outmaneuvered and accepts his defeat with grace. Morrison would later remember being struck by how ordinary Mallory seemed, how completely he had inhabited his role as an unremarkable American professional. There was nothing about the man that suggested the extraordinary life he had led, the secrets he had stolen, the loyalty he had maintained to a distant country that most Americans viewed as an implacable enemy. He was just a man in a bathrobe, drinking his morning coffee, watching his carefully constructed world fall apart. Petrov was arrested at his office in the Bronx, along with 3 other agents who were present at the time. Unlike Mallory, Petrov attempted to resist, struggling briefly with the agents before being subdued. He shouted in Russian, words that Morrison's translator later reported were curses and expressions of outrage at the violation of his home. But the struggle was brief, and within minutes, Petrov too was in handcuffs, being led to a waiting vehicle. Across the city, the remaining members of the network were apprehended at their homes and workplaces, most of them too stunned to offer any resistance. The trial that followed was one of the most significant espionage cases of the Cold War era. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators, all eager to witness the unmasking of a man who had lived among them as an ordinary American while secretly serving the Soviet Union. Richard Mallory, whose real name was revealed to be Alexei Sergeyevich Volkov, was a career KGB officer who had been inserted into the United States in 1952 using an elaborate legend built around the identity of a deceased American photographer whose records had been conveniently destroyed. The prosecutors presented a devastating case, weaving together the physical evidence found in Mallory's apartment with testimony from defectors and cooperating witnesses who described the operations of Soviet intelligence networks in the United States. Expert witnesses explained the techniques of Soviet dental work that had first aroused Dr. Finch's suspicions, showing the jury samples of different filling materials and describing how dental practices differed between American and Soviet training. Mallory sat through the trial with the same calm demeanor he had maintained since his arrest. He offered no defense, called no witnesses, and made no attempt to minimize his activities or shift blame to others. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, he said only that he had served his country according to his conscience and that he regretted nothing. The judge, visibly moved by the magnitude of the case, sentenced him to 40 years in federal prison. He had spent 7 years operating within the diplomatic community, gathering intelligence and recruiting sources for Moscow. His handler, Gregory Petrov, whose real name was Grigory Mikhailovich Petrov, had been running Soviet networks in the United States for more than a decade. Both men were convicted of espionage and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Several of the sources they had recruited chose to cooperate with the government in exchange for reduced sentences, providing information that led to the identification of additional Soviet intelligence operations in the United States and abroad. The damage assessment conducted after the arrests revealed that the network had compromised numerous diplomatic communications and at least 2 classified research programs. Dr. Harold Finch was never publicly identified as the source of the initial tip that had led to the investigation. The FBI preferred to keep his involvement confidential, both to protect his privacy and to avoid revealing the specific methods that had been used to identify Mallory as a foreign agent. But within the intelligence community, his contribution was recognized and appreciated. He received a personal letter of commendation from the director of the FBI, thanking him for his vigilance and his willingness to act on his professional instincts, even when the evidence seemed improbable. In the years that followed, Dr. Finch continued to practice dentistry in Manhattan, treating patients from all walks of life with the same meticulous attention to detail that had marked his entire career. He never discussed the Mallory case publicly, honoring the request for confidentiality that the FBI had made. But occasionally, when a patient would sit in his chair and open their mouth for examination, he would find himself studying their dental work with a new appreciation for what teeth could reveal about a person's history. The mouth, he had learned, was a map of a person's life. It recorded their childhood nutrition and their adult habits, their access to medical care and the techniques of the dentists who had treated them. It revealed where they had lived and when, the materials that had been available, and the standards of practice that had prevailed. For most patients, this map told an unremarkable story of ordinary dental care. But for those few whose stories did not match their claimed backgrounds, the teeth could betray secrets that no amount of careful legend building could fully conceal. Dr. Finch retired from practice in 1973, passing his office to a younger colleague who would continue to serve the patients he had treated for so many years. He spent his retirement years in Connecticut with his wife Margaret, tending a garden and reading the history books he had never had time for during his working life. He died peacefully in 1984 at the age of 78, remembered by his family and patients as a kind and skilled professional who had dedicated his life to the service of others. Few who attended his funeral knew that Dr. Harold Finch had once helped to dismantle one of the most dangerous Soviet spy networks ever to operate on American soil. Few knew that his trained eye had detected the subtle telltale signs that had led federal agents to their quarry. Few knew that a routine dental examination had changed the course of Cold War history. But somewhere in the classified files of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the record of his contribution remains, a testament to the power of professional expertise and the importance of trusting one's instincts, even when the conclusions they suggest seem too strange to believe. The Cold War was fought on many fronts, from the frozen tundra of the Arctic to the jungles of Southeast Asia, from the corridors of power in Washington and Moscow to the quiet suburban streets where ordinary Americans lived their ordinary lives. But sometimes the most important battles were fought in the most unexpected places, in a dentist's office on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where a man with a gift for observation and the courage to act on his suspicions helped to protect his country from those who would do it harm. Richard Mallory, or Alexei Volkov, as he was known to his handlers in Moscow, died in a Soviet prison in 1971, never having returned to the country he had served with such dedication. Gregory Petrov served 15 years in a federal penitentiary before being exchanged in 1974 for an American businessman who had been arrested in Moscow on trumped-up charges of espionage. Catherine Brennan, who had been unaware of her fiancé's true identity, testified at his trial and subsequently changed her name and moved to California, where she lived out her days in quiet obscurity. The story of the dentist who uncovered a Soviet spy through a strange detail in his teeth became part of FBI training materials used to teach new agents about the importance of unlikely sources and the value of professional expertise in counterintelligence work. It served as a reminder that the most dangerous enemies were often the most ordinary seeming, and that vigilance was required not just from intelligence professionals, but from ordinary citizens who might encounter something that simply did not add up. In the end, it was a story about the small details that matter, about the craft of observation and the courage to act on what one sees. Dr. Harold Finch was not a spy or a soldier. He was simply a dentist who knew his profession well enough to recognize when something was wrong. And in the shadow war of the Cold War, that knowledge made all the difference. The legacy of the Mallory case extended far beyond the immediate arrests and convictions. It prompted a thorough review of security procedures at the United Nations and other diplomatic institutions, leading to improved vetting processes for employees with access to sensitive information. It contributed to a broader understanding of Soviet intelligence methods, particularly the use of elaborate legends and long-term infiltration strategies. And it served as a reminder that the battle against espionage required the participation of the entire society, not just the professionals whose job it was to catch spies. For Dr. Finch, the experience confirmed something he had always believed but never articulated. Every profession, no matter how seemingly removed from the great affairs of state, had the potential to contribute to the common good. The skills and knowledge that people developed in their daily work could have applications far beyond their immediate purpose. And the obligation to serve one's community extended to everyone, regardless of their occupation or station in life. He never sought recognition for what he had done. He never wrote a memoir or gave interviews to journalists seeking the inside story of the Mallory case. He simply continued to practice his profession with the same dedication and skill that had characterized his entire career, knowing that he had done his duty, and that sometimes that was enough. The Cold War would continue for another 3 decades after the Mallory arrests, bringing new crises and new confrontations, new spies and new scandals. The world would change in ways that Dr. Finch could never have imagined, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union transforming the international order he had known throughout his adult life. But the lessons of the Mallory case remained relevant, a reminder that vigilance and expertise were the foundations of security, and that ordinary citizens could make extraordinary contributions when they trusted their instincts and had the courage to act. In the annals of Cold War espionage, the case of the dentist who spotted a Soviet spy through his dental work stands as one of the most unusual and instructive episodes. It demonstrates that intelligence gathering is not just the province of agencies and agents, but a collaborative effort that depends on the observations of people throughout society. It shows that professional expertise, carefully applied, can reveal truths that would otherwise remain hidden. And it reminds us that the defense of freedom is ultimately the responsibility of everyone who values it. Dr. Harold Finch understood this truth instinctively, even if he would never have expressed it in such grandiose terms. He was a modest man who believed in doing his job well and treating his patients with care and respect. But when circumstances placed him in a position to make a difference, he did not hesitate. He picked up the telephone and made a call that would change history, never knowing how far the ripples of that single action would spread. That is the nature of consequential moments. They rarely announce themselves in advance. They come disguised as ordinary events, as routine examinations and casual observations, as small anomalies that most people would overlook or dismiss. It takes a certain kind of person to recognize these moments for what they are, and to respond to them appropriately. Dr. Harold Finch was such a person, and his country was fortunate to have him. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I am sure you will enjoy it. See you next time.